We recommend this product be installed by a competent gunsmith.
Modification of your firearm may nullify the warranty of the firearm's manufacturer.
No liability is expressed or implied for damage or injury which may occur from improper use or installation of this product.
You are responsible for the safe handling, legalities, and use of your firearm.
Warning: always wear safety glasses when working on firearms. Hey guys, today I'm here to walk you through installation of the Apex forward set trigger kits for the M&P M2.0 metal frame specific trigger kits. The contents of this kit include a striker block and striker block spring. I've got the Apex rear sight reinstallation tool here, but be mindful, most of the metal frame guns have the core cut, so you don't need to use this tool, but it's part of the kit, so we'll include it. You have the forward set trigger. This comes in either flat or curve and red and black and a handful of other colors. So any of the forward set kits for the metal frame, this video encompasses all of that. You have two trigger return springs. Silver is the medium weight or duty carry weight, and you have the green for the heavy weight. You also have the slave pin for the front to help tension the trigger return spring. We've got a 2-dot sear and a sear actuator. Be mindful, the Apex actuator has a little toe out on the front compared to the factory, and our sear has 2 dots. You need to install all of these components, especially the sear and actuator and the trigger, to make everything work properly. The rest you can leave out if you want to, or change them out, whatever. The sear, the actuator, and the trigger body have to be used in conjunction with one another. We've also got 3 sear springs in this package now. You have the purple, which is heavy, the silver, which is duty carry rated, basically, or middle rate, and then you have the light one, which is orange painted, and now it comes with a sear plunger. The factory metal frame guns come with a mono spring, just a single spring with no plunger in anymore. We recommend for the most reliable function, our plunger, which we include in the package, and one of the 3 springs. Being a different spring weight, just install whichever one you want, but make sure you use the plunger and one of the springs. Tools required for this installation are a hammer and a 3/32 inch pin punch. Now, I also like to use a roll of tape as a bench block. You can use one of these blue polymer or anybody else's hockey puck with a hole in it, whatever, as a bench block. But I like the tape because it's non-marring. I can use it for adhesives, whatever else. I also recommend having a relatively wide common screwdriver on hand, and I'll show you what we use that for in a little bit here, as well as a 0.50 diameter or 0.50 width hex wrench, as well as in this case, 5/64. That's to take the screws out of the slide when you're doing the striker block installation. Before I start pushing pins out, I want to caution you. The front locking block, this guy here, is inserted into a polymer recess in the frame. So when you go to pull the front locking assembly out, you're also going to be pulling out the little polymer insert that goes from about here to here. What I like to do is I like to try to separate those so I can keep the polymer and put it back in the frame. So I'm going to show you with a screwdriver how to keep those separated when you remove them from the frame. Just be aware you have a polymer insert at the front and one at the back that we're going to set parts into. We want to be aware of that when we take components out. Okay, I have done the factory field stripping recommendation for moving the slide and barrel from the receiver. I have no magazine in. Obviously this is just the lower receiver with disassembled. So first thing I want to make sure I do is keep my takedown lever roughly in the down position. I'm going to flip the frame over and I'm going to punch all my pins out from the right side, but I do want to double check my takedown lever is still pointing downward because I don't want anything to hit it. Now I need to remove the front locking block pin, the trigger pivot pin, and the sear housing pin. And I can use my 3/32 pin punch for all of those. I generally like to push out the trigger pivot pin first, after I've, again, double-checked my takedown lever is in the down position, clearing that pin entirely. Once this is out, the other two will pop right out also, but this is the one I'm most worried about tapping out with everything else free. So, again, trigger pivot pin comes out first. Should just pop right out, and then I can work on the front locking block pin. Now in this case, it's a little hard to move, so I'm going to move this closer to the edge of the inside of my tape so that I can really get that thing moving. And again, I just want to make sure my takedown lever is not actually in the way. So in this case it was, so I'm going to push it back up out of the way. Put that pin on there and I'm going to tap that guy in. Once it pops through, I'll just pull it out. I'll drop it into my little roll of tape. Switch to the back side as well. Same thing here. Once that's out, I'm going to turn the frame up on its upward and I'm going to start pulling components out. Get that guy out of there, come on. Man, it does not want to move, so I'll give it another little tap here. There we go. Now it popped right out. Okay, from there, I'll turn up and I'll start pulling components out. So I mentioned the polymer insert in the frame. You see these little bulbs out here. There's one here and one here that are in the frame. The locking block here is metal. The front little piece is polymer. I'm going to take the edge of my screwdriver and I'm going to put it in here, and I'm going to place it so the bottom edge touches the polymer piece in the frame and the top is on the locking block. At this point, I'm just going to give it a little twist to pop the locking block up a little bit. And then I'll make sure my takedown lever's out of the way, and I can pull this guy up and out. Now, I want to put the polymer piece back into the frame when I'm done. I can separate, once the slide lock lever comes out, I can separate these two. Kind of hard to do. That's why I use a screwdriver. You can also go in here with the screwdriver, give it a little twist to pop the locking block out. And then the recoil damper in the frame can be put back in at any time, but we need to do that before the rest of the gun goes back together. So you may as well store it in there because we're going to put it back in first later on. With the front locking assembly out, the trigger bar can come up and out of the frame, and as well as the sear housing. Sometimes these are a little tough to pull out. I can typically grab the ejector and wiggle it up. If it doesn't come up, I like to take my pin punch from the side and pry up a little bit on both sides to get it to slide up. You can also pry forward, and then grab the ejector and pull it right out. You've got a polymer insert back here in the frame. It normally stays in place, so you don't have to worry about it. I want to show you the differences between the polymer frames and the aluminum. Obviously, there is a big difference. One's polymer, one's aluminum. But remember, a metal frame is machined. You can see machine marks here on the inside of the trigger mortise where whatever cutter they were using came in and made the cuts for the trigger mortise. Now, that's the critical part. This is why our trigger kit has to be different. The safety is different because the trigger mortise is different in the metal frames than the polymers. We had to change the stick out and the orientation of the stopping surface for drop safety. So metal frames have the stop here in a little different orientation than the polymer frames. Anyway, the next thing I want to show you is the over-travel stop. The factory builds in a polymer over-travel stop that is just pressed in from the inside of the trigger guard. If you look at the inside of the frame, you can see a nice big threaded hole here with the end of the insert in it. Now that insert looks like a screw, but it's actually not. It's just a slotted piece of polymer. I'm going to take my pin punch from the back end here and I'm going to push that guy out into the trigger guard to get it out of my frame. And there it goes. So I'm going to push it in a little bit, and then I can reach in here and just pop it right out. This has to be removed when you install the Apex trigger. You cannot install our trigger and have it work with that in place. Pull it out. The hole in the frame is not going to get any more dirty or any more grungy or anything else than it already was. At this point, it's just a hole that an over-travel stop from the factory could be installed in. It's not. We're abandoning that hole and we're using the top of the trigger guard area as an over-travel stop with the Apex trigger body. Next thing we're going to do is disassemble the factory sear housing. I want you to be aware, there's the front pin down here for the disassembly lever. We do not need to use this pin, so leave that one in. Don't touch it. We need to pull out the sear pin. The sear pin is a headed pin. One side is smaller, flip it around, the other side is larger. That also holds your ejector in your sear housing. So all we have to do is take our pin punch, in this case the 3/32. I'm going to push the sear pin out, and I'm going to take the space of that sear pin with my pin punch. That way I can fully pull the factory sear pin out of the way. Now, from here I'm going to hold my thumb on top of the sear. I'm going to remove my pin and release spring tension slowly. From there, I can take the factory sear and just slide it out of there, and the factory actuator. Factory actuator is white and does not have the little tab at the front like the Apex does. And the factory sear, in this case, is a MEM sear. It's got little square pocket and letters on the side. You're going to replace these with the Apex components, just be aware. Also in the sear housing, you have a sear spring. Turn this guy over, normally a couple taps, pops right out. That's the factory, what I call a mono spring. The spring does not require a plunger. We include a plunger and springs to replace this. So you're going to remove this and all three of these components from the sear housing, set them aside. Apex is replacing those in your kit. I want to give you a quick rundown of the comparison of the factory components versus Apex. The factory components, you have the sear spring here, you have the sear itself, and then the factory actuator. The Apex actuator has a longer toe on the front top edge. You need to install this, especially with our trigger. Our sear has 2 dots on the side, which you can see right here at the back. And we also include a sear plunger and 3 different springs. In this case, I'm using the standard silver spring for medium weight, but there's also a purple and an orange in the kit. Make sure you pick the spring that you want to use. Let's go ahead and reassemble the sear housing. The first thing I'm going to do is take the Apex plunger and spring, and remember, you can use any of the 3 springs we include in the package, and you can download the chart off of our blog explaining which spring does what. I put the plunger and spring together and I stick it right into the sear housing. It just drops right in. Make sure the plunger should sit roughly at about the top of the ledge at the back of the sear housing right here. I'll take the sear itself. Remember, use the Apex 2-dot sear. I'll set that right on top of that plunger where the back 2 dots are just above the plunger. Yes, it will sit up at a funny angle, and that's completely normal. I'm going to put my pin punch on here. I'm going to press down against spring force. And then I'll take my headed pin. Remember, it's a unidirectional pin. It has to go in from the side of the ejector, so from the left. Press that in, and I'm going to wiggle up and down with my pin punch here to capture the pin into the sear. Now at this point my sear is kind of angled out a little bit. I'm going to just touch it over. And try to get where you can see it here. Just touch it over my fingernail, and then the pin just goes right in. Now I can push it all the way across like you see here, and you can see the pin has come all the way across. However, the gap here next to the sear lobe, this little feature right here, has to accommodate the sear actuator. So I'm going to push that back with my pin punch. I'll show you here this way. Push my pin punch back this way so I can push the sear pin back and clear the gap on the housing and make a space right there for the actuator to go in. I typically grab the actuator and hold it in kind of this orientation, and I'll slide it in and rotate it down into position to catch on the sear. Now, what you're looking for is that the little opening on the front of the actuator encompasses the sear lobe itself visibly. From here, I can just push my sear pin back across, and I have to wiggle and jiggle a little bit sometimes, but then it goes right in. And once I'm there, I'm going to flip it around, and I'm going to make sure that my sear pin head is below the side of the ejector. And from here, we can reassemble it. The next step is to replace the factory trigger on the trigger bar. So I'm going to take my pin punch, and I'm going to press the pin out from the right side of the factory trigger. Give it a few taps. Doesn't have to go all the way out, just about halfway. Pull that guy out, and then my trigger bar comes right off. This is a good time to clean the trigger bar, make sure everything is good. Before we reassemble it, I want to point out one thing about the trigger bar. The factory trigger bar, this is the tail of the trigger bar, this little guy down here. This one you see here is flat across the bottom. Oftentimes I see them angled up at the back. This will affect trigger pull. So when you have it apart, check your tail is straight. And it just basically means the section from here to here and the section from here to here are parallel. It should just be nice and straight like this one is. This should work without a problem. The best method to install the trigger bar into the trigger body is a vise. This is a smooth jaw vise. I took the jaws out, I machined them down flat, and I have tape on both faces, some of my blue masking tape, to prevent marring the surface on the aluminum trigger body. So the method I use is this. You're going to put the trigger bar in, roughly align the hole, and then you're going to basically close the vise slowly and carefully to insert the pin. My recommendation is I put the trigger body with the V opening, the V notch, in the upward position. I'll hold it back here at the back, and I'll drop it in so my pin is just below the top surface of my vise jaws, and I'll gradually close my vise to hold it in place. Now at this point I have access to the V groove. Now remember, the trigger bar has to go in the orientation where the top hole, let me pull it out here and show you again. The top hole of the trigger body and the little tab on the back for the safety pickup, those are both in the up position. People have installed them upside down. That's not appropriate. You want to have the trigger bar set up where it installs like this. Hole up, tab up. That's the proper orientation for the installation. So I'm going to drop the trigger body back in the vise and just touch it down. I'm going to move the bar in, and I'm going to kind of wiggle back and forth. Let me move this around a little bit so you can see what I'm doing perspective-wise. What you're basically going to do is you're going to put the bar in the right orientation first, and I'm going to kind of wiggle in that V groove up and down. I'm mostly working in the bottom of that groove, and I'm going to kind of move around and feel for that pin to overtake the hole. Now, once I feel it's capturing, I'm going to stop, back up my vise, and I'm going to check and make sure that my pin is coming through the trigger bar like it's supposed to. If that's good, go ahead and set that guy right back in. I'm going to finish seating the pin. Now, from my perspective, I can see it, but I want you to see it in internet land. So see the gap right here between the trigger body and the vise jaw? That's exactly what we want. We're going to close it gradually until that closes, and then stop. We don't need to crush it. We do not want to crush the trigger. Pull it out from here. We'll take a look at it. Now, my pin is slightly proud on this surface. That's not a problem. I'm going to put that on my vise anvil, this guy over here. I'm going to put some tape on it to protect it. I'll use a pin punch and give that a little tap to make sure it's flush with that surface. It will not be flush on the outside over here, but that doesn't matter. As long as it's sub-flush, or at least flush on one side, we're good. So I put a piece of tape on my vise so I don't damage my surface, and all I've got basically is a little bit of that pin to push down. I'm going to take my pin punch, set it on there, and just give it a tap. It doesn't need a lot. One quick whack. I can feel that pin move. Good. I'm just barely sub-flush on this side. Flip it over. I'm sub over there, and I can double check my safety works. It clicks. It does what we call the tick test. Does it tick when you let go? It does. Okay. We're good to go. Now we can assemble this whole thing into the frame. Next, we're going to go ahead and assemble the front trigger assembly so we can drop it all into the pistol. These are the components we need. The trigger and bar assembled, the slide lock lever, trigger return spring, and the trigger return spring slave pin. Real straightforward installation. When you're going to put the trigger return spring on the trigger bar, what I do is I go from the back end on top and I hook, remember, on the spring itself you have an open small end, and you have a closed large end. That large end goes into the trigger body. Basically, it's going to be oriented like I have here on the trigger bar. The opening on the small side is up on the trigger bar, and then you've got the large opening through the hole in the trigger. I'll demonstrate that now. So my method for installing this is basically going from the top, capturing the little lip on the spring around the tab on the trigger bar. This one's being a little bit of a pain right now. Probably the angle I'm doing it at, but there we go. Try to hook it on this guy and get it through the hole. Once I've got it through the hole in the trigger bar, I'm going to roll it up into the trigger bar body. Now, remember, I need, and I absolutely have to emphasize need, the opening in the trigger bar return spring, excuse me, to be in the up position when the trigger spring is installed into the trigger like so. So remember, oops, you can see it here better. Opening upward on here and this going all the way in. From there, I can take my slide lock levers and I can set it right over the trigger body. I'll take my slave pin and I'm going to put this in from the left side to the right with the rounded surface going in first into the trigger body, and I'm going to basically go through the slide lock lever into the trigger body. I'm going to capture the trigger return spring. There we go. I got to move it where I can get it here. Get the trigger return spring captured by that pin and push all the way across. Once I'm there, you can see I have the whole thing assembled and captured for use. Now, I'm able to drop this in the gun. Now, to test the assembly, this is real straightforward. I'll hold the pin in place so it doesn't fall out. I'll grab the trigger body and the bar like this and just give it a squeeze. And make sure that the trigger return spring stretches when I give it a squeeze. Now I know I can continue assembling this. Now that we have the front assembly done, we're going to go ahead and put it in the frame. One thing I want to caution you about, when I just did this a minute ago, I had made the mistake when I did my stretching of the trigger bar. I allowed my slide lock lever to get above that and it actually locked it up. So make sure the slide lock lever is on the outside of the trigger bar like you see there before you put it in. From here, I'm holding the pin in place so it doesn't go anywhere. I'm going to drop my recoil, my little recoil buffer I mentioned before, into my frame. This is a good time to clean your frame out, get all the schmutz and gunk out of there and extra lube from previously. So now's a good time since you have it apart. Go from there, I'm going to take the trigger body, drop it right down to the trigger mortise. My slide lock lever will hit the frame appropriately. Trigger bar will sit here at the back, and it's okay to free float. We're going to mess with that later. Next thing we need to do, we're going to flip it over. We're going to take a look at the trigger pivot pinhole. You can see through here, I just got a little of the yellow showing on screen, which is great, but I still have to put my locking block in. Now, your takedown lever drops right in and out. It has to be inserted first and has to be inserted all the way into the locking block before it goes in the frame. If you have it sitting like this, a little bit out, not good. Go all the way down, make sure that takedown lever is all the way in the locking block. Rotate it into the down or the unlock position. We're going to set that in the frame and slide it all the way down on top of the takedown lever and the trigger. Now, in this case, it's a little bit sticky, so I'm going to wiggle the trigger and now it dropped right on top. Again, I can kind of see the yellow through the hole in the frame. We're going to use that, and what we're going to do is we're going to take the trigger pivot pin, which is the solid headed pin where you have one side tapered and one side with a larger head on it. We're going to go in from the left to right and try to overtake that pin. Now is the hard part. We're going to zoom in and show you the alignment and installation of that pin. Now, from my eye, I see a lot of things that are out of position right here. For example, the locking block isn't fully seated. I can push it down. I can also see the trigger body itself wasn't in the full normal position. So we need to get everything in full alignment to get it together. But when I push the locking block down, you notice the trigger no longer shows, it shows more of a half moon inside the hole there. It actually looks like it loses some of the alignment. Not a bad thing, but I need to make sure I align everything. Remember, you're going through the walls of the takedown lever, the trigger, the recoil buffer system too, the spring itself, and then the other side of everything. We've got a bunch of walls to go through, so this is a little bit tricky. Here's my method. I'll use the slave pin that's provided, and I'll press the locking block down first. That's the first wall I'm going to come into is the frame. So I'm going to push that in as far as I can, and it's going to at least start. Now the locking block, you'll notice, is solid. Now I've got it through the first wall. So now this is where it gets a little more difficult. I like to use my tabletop to my advantage here. I'm going to kind of press on this and show you, but normally I would just use the table and press the frame straight down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press on the back here, and I'm going to try to give you a view of the frame. You can't really see the yellow in there, but as we go, I'm going to move the trigger body up and down ever so slightly as I press. Oh, it might just fly right through for me, like that. Once it aligns, it pushes right in. But you need to move the trigger and wiggle things around to let that pin push all the way in. And literally, you saw it just flew right out. Sometimes I'll put it on the table and I'll push it down, but doing it this way, just pop right through. Once everything's aligned, it goes. A thing to remember, the trigger bar should be sitting up here. If you have it pressed way down, that will actually slow it down. So make sure you have the trigger bar up. You can also press the trigger safety and deactivate, get the trigger bar all the way up if it helps to relieve the spring. Okay, I've reverted my frame back to the state I had it before with everything installed ready for me to seat and push the pins in place. I want to re-show you this again because that one it pretty much fell together, and I don't want to make it seem like this should just fall together. Sometimes these are more difficult. A tip for you to work on: hold the locking block down, hold the trigger bar down, press the trigger safety and trigger, and then let the trigger bar up. That fully detensions the trigger return spring in here, which allows for easier installation of the pins. Once I have that there, I'm going to take my headed pin, the narrow end first, put it in, make sure my locking block is down, and I'm going to capture that locking block so now when I push on it, it doesn't wiggle. Now again, same thing as before, I'm pressing on that to make sure it's there. I'm through the first wall. I'm going to flip it around, and I'm again trying to align it where you guys can see it, and hopefully not shoot the little slave pin out at you again. But the idea here is I'm going to keep pressing on it, and if I need to, I'll grab the trigger body and wiggle it. Oh, there it goes again. Wiggle it up and down and just push that guy in. And as you can see, the slave pin pops right out, and I'll push that pin all the way in and make sure we're subflush. From here, we can go ahead and install the front locking block pin. And that locking block pin is any of the two other pins that came out. They are identical, same size, same function on the metal frames. I'll put this one in, and I'll tap it in. In this case, my hammer itself has a nylon face on it, so I don't do any damage to things. I'm going to flip this over, make sure everything looks good. I'm seeing a pin coming right out like it's supposed to. Put this right over my block, and I'm going to give it a nice tap with my pin punch. And again, be careful. If you have a metal frame, you're going to have it's a Cerakoted frame, so you can scratch the finish. Give it a couple taps, make sure it goes in. Make sure I'm just above flush on this side. Flip it over. I'm just about flush on that side, so we're good to go. From here, we'll go ahead and install the sear housing assembly, and then we're finished with the frame and move on to the slide. Now I've got my front trigger assembly all done and pinned back in place. Now I'm going to use my sear housing block and put this back in. At this point, you can see I'm holding the trigger and safety down, which springs the trigger bar up. The way this goes in is the toe of the trigger bar comes in not under the sear. Some people will stick it underneath the sear. That's a problem. And you come in from the side and drop it into the notch on the side of the sear housing, like you can see there. You should see it from the outside like that. Once that's there, I can roll it down into the frame. Now, on the front of the sear housing block, you've got these little rails. Those are guidance rails that have to hit in the frame. It does not go straight in. It goes in at that angle when you go put it in. So I'll hold the trigger bar and body down, assemble it onto the bar, and I'm going to bring it back and slide it into those notches, and it'll seat all the way down. The indicator that it's right, I can see all the way through the frame, like you can see right there. From that point, all I have to do is put my pin in, put it on my block, and I'm going to tap that guy all the way in. Once it's there, I'm going to flip it over, check that I'm sub-flush on both sides, and now my frame is reassembled for checkout. We're going to go straight into the slide next. So, in the core equipped guns that have the optic cuts from Smith & Wesson, we need to take off the core optic cover plate. The striker block is underneath there, so I'm using the right size hex wrench to get this guy off. And this guy happens to be a 5/64. I do not know if that's the standard for the factory across the board. I don't know if they ever changed them. So don't quote me on the size. Make sure you know what your pistol has when you go to take the parts off, so you can always put them back on. Now, in this case, I'm using really high-end RC car brand. These are actually Dynamite RC brand heavily ground Allen wrenches. These things are nice. I literally will not buy anything else now. They work. Oftentimes the cover plate will come right off with a fingernail. Sometimes I've had to go underneath it with a pocket knife to pry the little cover plate off because they tend to get a little sticky, but it comes right off. Now, we need to pull the striker block out of here. Most of these I've seen are using a .050 hex wrench to remove it. I have seen some that have Torx screws. I don't think that's a current though. I think it's still the 050 Allen wrench size. This guy can be tough to remove. This is why I prefer the high-end ground steel wrenches, because watch, I'll do it now on camera, but I've never stripped out one of these little guys with one of these wrenches. So I'm going to get this guy in, and I'm going to bury it into find the flats. I'm going to bury that guy in nice and deep, and I'm going to press as I turn. I will oftentimes put my finger on the striker block cover and press down ever so slightly to take tension off. And now I can loosen that screw and get it out of there. These screws oftentimes do have a little bit of blue or yellow thread locker compound on them. Let's see if this one does or not. This one has red thread locker compound. No problem. Most of the time it comes right out. If it's not coming out readily, get a better driver. If you're going to go to the hardware store and buy the cheap ones, probably not going to work. Get yourself good drivers, good tools to get the job done right. I'll go ahead and pull that screw out. I'm going to leave that right there on my driver, so I'm about to put it right back. I'm going to take the cover plate off. Oftentimes the factory spring does stay on the cover plate, which is really convenient. The factory cover plate has a little boss right here in the middle that you can just kind of see that the spring goes on. So I'm going to take the Apex spring, I'm going to put it on, and I'll set that aside. I'm going to go underneath with another wrench and just push up the striker block and dump it out of the slide, and I can swap it for the Apex. The two parts are very similar. Let me show you those a little closer up now. Quick description of the two striker blocks you see side by side. The factory striker block from Smith & Wesson has a bit more of a radius on the edges. The Apex one has a bit more of a flat on top and then more of a sharp radius to it. Either one works. We include one with the kit because we always have, and it seems to always be the best result for us. I'll go ahead and take the Apex striker block, which has the larger flat on it. I'll just drop it right into the slide. It should drop all the way down. At this point, I'll take the factory cover plate and the Apex spring. The Apex spring doesn't always stick on the plate, so you might have to put it back on there. What I like to do actually is put the spring into the striker block first. I'll take the plate and I will attach the boss on the plate into the spring. You've got to make sure that boss is on there. If you don't, you're going to end up with the spring getting sideways. So get that boss onto the spring. There we go. And now I'm going to hold that down with one finger, get that into position. Now I'll take the screw that's already on my driver, put it back on there, and screw it down. I'm going to hold it down while I go all the way down with that screw to make sure that it holds in place. Once it's in place, I'll stop. I'll double check the plate is all the way down. Now, what I've seen a couple of times is the plate itself will be up and askew over here. If that's the case, press it down with your finger, loosen the screw, rotate over it, then drop it in. If you don't, you're likely to damage the plate or the slide or the finish and bring material you don't want into the striker block channel. So make sure it sits like that. Once it's there, I'm going to, again, bury my driver all the way in to make sure I fully engage that screw. My finger on it, I'm going to give it a little torque, and it doesn't need a lot. That's probably like 7 to 10 inch-pounds at the most. You don't need to gauge it, just get in there and get it snug, which is basically touching down with a little bit of twist, and that's it. From here, let's double check the striker block works properly. I'll press the block down, make sure it returns under spring force, like so. And then I'll also press the striker block in, press the striker forward. I can confirm that I have a striker tip going through the breech, and I'll release, and I'll press against that block, and it's stopping it as it's supposed to. This is proper function. Everything is assembled. I want to show you a couple things about the slide before we proceed on and final reassemble. I want to show you the striker channel liner, and that's inside the slide here. I want to make sure it's present. There have been times where we've seen them without, we've seen people have removed them by accident or whatever else. You want to make sure that's in there, because if you don't, you're going to be calling my customer service asking why you're getting light strikes, and then we're going to tell you, well, you're missing a part. Sorry. So let's check for a liner real quick. To get the striker out, there's a little white sleeve right here at the back. You see that guy right there in the channel? That's a spring-loaded sleeve that holds the back plate on. So all I got to do is put a pin punch in there. I'm going to press forward toward the muzzle against spring tension, and I'm going to slide the back plate right off and out of the way. I can relieve that spring tension gently, and then from there I'll put my finger on the end of the slide, and I'll press the striker block and pop. Now it's ready to come out. I can push the striker out the back, grab onto it, and I can remove it from the slide. Now I'm going to show you a couple features about these two things in the next scene. I want to show you real quickly a couple features about the slide. First of all, we have the striker channel liner. You can see the little red peeking out here. That is the channel liner. That is supposed to be in all the M2.0s. I believe the 45s use a different color, but there should be a polymer liner inside your slide. Also, the striker itself, I'm not sure you can really see it, but I'll try to hold it where you can. The striker itself has a little marking here on the side, and that says 10 degrees. In fact, it's upside down for your perspective. Let me flip it over there. It says 10 degrees. That tells us that the striker face has been angled back by 10 degrees, which is, from the factory, the norm. We see that more and more in guns now. This is the most recent striker type. That gives you the lighter of the trigger pulls. So when you see our trigger pull chart, this is the 10-degree striker mentioned versus the classic that does not have any markings. I am uncertain if the markings are on only one side or potentially on either side. I've never seen it on both, but I know I've always seen it at least on one side if it's a 10-degree striker. So things to be aware of. And when you go to put it back together, it's real straightforward. Drop the striker in as far as you can into the channel liner. It'll take a second, there we go, to align. Get that guy back in and all the way down. From here, I'm going to put a little force on the back on the retainer. Press the striker block in until it passes the striker block. Now my retainer sleeve is right here at the back of the slide. Now, take my back plate. I'm going to slide it in as far as I can possibly go against that retainer. I'm going to hold my thumb against that pressure, and now what I'm going to do, holding it like that, I'm going to press my pin punch against the white sleeve until my back plate comes up. Now I can relieve pressure off of here, pull my pin out because I don't want to damage the slide finish. Press it up till it clicks. Now it's in place. From here, I'm just going to do a quick recheck. My striker block functions, and my striker does, in fact, penetrate into the breech like it's supposed to. Let's see here. You can see it. Oops. There we go. It's getting into the breech. It retracts, and I'm blocking. This is proper function. I'm going to go ahead and put the cover plate back on with its screws, and then we can assemble everything and do a thorough test. With our install finished, we're going to go ahead and do a thorough function test. Number one, of course, I'm going to double check the gun is unloaded, which I've confirmed already multiple times off camera, but I'm going to do it on just for fun. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put it back into normal battery. The slide is fully forward. Everything is in place. I'm going to go ahead and fully dry fire. Finger on trigger on the safety. It breaks. I'm going to hold the trigger down, cycle the slide. Release slowly. Listen for the click. Have a good reset. Re-engage. Fire. Do it a couple times just because it feels really good. Now, I'm also going to cycle the slide to reset the trigger. I'm going to press the trigger body itself so that my safety hits the frame and guarantee and verify it does not bypass the frame. If this does not bypass, I'll put my finger on the safety to let it disengage, and it fires. If you bypass the frame, call our customer service. We want to know what's going on because the frames have been pretty consistent from the factory with the right safety. Other things to check would be just to make sure that, again, the gun is functioning. Your slide lock lever should be up, down out of the way and should have spring tension holding it downward when it comes to the lockup. So if you press it up, it should actually come back down under spring force on its own. It should not lock up and stay up. If something is wrong there, take it back apart and take a look at it. Other than that, we're all set. The gun's ready to go to the range and test out. Hey, thanks for watching. If you have any questions about your installation or any issues, contact our customer service. That's what we're here for.